Hey, I'm Lexi, and this is what you should know. I told you wouldn't have to wait long. The funny thing is, I really did not start out with this topic thinking it would be a multi-parter. I figured it would be a nice, neat, one-and-done kind of episode. But no, I found a shocking amount of information on this. And because I know it, you must know it too. That's how family works. And you know what else family does? They harass the 5-star review button. So if you haven't already, please do that. It would make me so happy. So strap in once again, because this is what you should know about Frederick Deeming. We left off with Frederick having been married 3 times. 2 wives and 4 children have been brutally murdered by this pig, and he is now in Australia once again, and trying to flee the country, all whilst trying to court another lady. Now, while this had all been happening, police were on the trail of the monster that had buried the woman under the slate slab in Melbourne. Detectives Considine and Corsi, who were placed in charge, had seen a lot in their years and weren't easily shaken in any sense of the word. Granted, at the start there was very little for them to go on, but the detectives persevered and ordered an autopsy on the body. 2 doctors who I could sadly not find the names of were brought in as they were considered highly skilled in post-mortem work. The doctors found that the wounds on the skull would not have been enough to kill their Jane Doe, and they concluded that the woman had been struck from behind with a blunt instrument, such as the back of a tomahawk, and her throat was cut while she was unconscious. The detectives speculated that the murderer had sent his victim on some errand which would keep her away from the house long enough for him to dig the grave in the back room and mix a cement that would then entomb her body. The fact that all of these would have taken a decent amount of time to achieve, because remember, she was under a slab. So he would have had to have removed the mantelpiece, raised the slate slab, and then dug a hole large enough to contain her body, means she would have been seen in public. On her return, the detectives theorized that the murderer would have persuaded her to have a bath to refresh herself after being out. Now, as we know, Frederick and Emily were married at this time, and she didn't know anything too ugly of him, aside from maybe his face. So she would have thought that this was a sweet idea of him to have her relax after running an errand, especially since it was the dead of summer and she would have been walking, likely dripping with sweat. So the thought of a tepid bath would have sounded lovely. Can confirm I felt that recently when I was doing some gardening. The detectives believed it was while she was undressing that he suddenly entered the bathroom, struck her on the head, and stunned her. He then dragged her body into the bedroom where the hole had been dug, and he slit her throat. Frederick then stripped Emily of her clothes for 2 reasons. 1, to provide more room in the hole, and 2, to make identification more difficult should the body ever be unearthed. And Frederick was not counting on the body ever being unearthed. Emily was bound with what was listed as a silken cord so that it would pack into the smallest possible space. The cement was poured and carefully levelled. The slate slab was relaid and the mantelpiece fixed back in its position. If you had entered the room after, you would have never have known that a body had just been buried. But Frederick was never as smart as he believed he was, as he either forgot or never knew that a decomposing body generates gases which cause it to swell, which this is what caused the cement to raise and crack, creating a vent for the smell of death to escape and fill the small house. The doctors who gave the autopsy also estimated the body had been dead from 6 to 8 weeks, which lined up with when Mr. Druin had rented the property. It was reported that half a barrel of cement, sand, towel, a spade, and a broom were delivered to the villa from an ironmonger's shop in High Street, and these were also purchased by the same Mr. Druin. With this, detectives were confident on the first lead and knew that the murder was in fact premeditated. Talking to the neighbours, they claimed they saw the woman around town until about the 24th of December. Mr. Bueller, the manager of a laundry nearby, claimed he saw her that day when he called in to deliver some clothes that he had cleaned, but never saw her again. With that, it was confirmed that their Jane Doe had been murdered on Christmas Eve. The only question they had left was why. but they decided it was more important, and understandably so, to figure out who the victim and murderer was. Their only clues were a small piece of a copy of the Liverpool Guardian, a baggage ticket bearing the stamp of Mrs. F. Tate and Co. Bagging Agents of Melbourne, and an invitation that was blurred. This information was published in the Melbourne newspaper along with a description of the man who had rented the house and ordered the cement. A man named Max Hirschfeld immediately contacted the detectives and told them that he believed a man calling himself Droon was the same man known as Albert Williams, who, accompanied by Mrs. Williams, came to Victoria in the German ship the Kaiser Wilhelm II, arriving in Melbourne on the 16th of December, 1891. Max had been a passenger on the same ship and had seen the couple while in transit. He described it as an ill-assorted pair, further describing the husband as a blustering, blatant, self-assertive, bullying man, while the wife was a mild-mannered, intelligent, and ladylike woman who appeared to live in constant dread of her husband. Emily had confided to some of the other passengers that her relatives lived near Liverpool and that she had been married a few weeks before the voyage. Her husband was a non-stop talker, particularly about his wife, who in his more pleasant moments he described her as the dearest little woman in the world, and would then ramble with his dim-witted satisfaction that his wife had been left fatherless when she was a child and struggled to support her mother and sisters. This fact is true, but it was not his story to tell. Emily had spent her childhood selling newspapers, and her determination in combination with her charming personality attracted the attention of the Liverpool representative of the great newspaper distributing firm of W.H. Smith & Son, who established her mother and herself in a stationery business, which had turned out a great success. Max was taken to the Melbourne morgue to identify the body that had been found, and sadly, he confirmed it was in fact Emily Williams. He also provided a full description of Mr. Williams, and the description is as follows. 5'8" in height, stoutly built with a fair complexion and a fair moustache. He spoke with a Lancashire accent, described himself as an engineer, and always wore a large quantity of jewellery. The detectives were convinced that Mr. Williams was the murderer, but with that knowledge, it still left them wondering what his motive was, as they could not find one. They didn't believe it was money because Emily did not come from a wealthy background. Jealousy was out of the question, since all of the passengers on the Kaiser Wilhelm II, whom the detectives had interviewed, were unanimous in their opinion that there could not have been a more devoted wife, and the idea of a fit of rage did not fit the fact that it was so obviously premeditated. The only conclusion the detectives could accept was that Emily had discovered some secret in her husband's past life which he feared she might betray. This prompted the detectives to go deeper into Mr. Williams. Sure, they had figured out that Mr. Williams and Mr. Droon were in fact the same person, which had amazed those around them, but they did come off a little cocky by publishing a statement that the detectives were confident that they would have the murderer arrested within a week. One carrier, named Harford, notified the police that on December 18th he had taken luggage from a customs store in Wrigley's Free Store in Queen Street, Melbourne, for a man closely resembled the description of the murderer. Another carrier, named Featherstone, moved some luggage from Wrigley Store to number 57, and a third carrier brought the luggage in early January to a shop on Little Collins Street, which had been rented by the murderer. A fortnight after the murder of Emily, Frederick, who was going by Mr. Williams, pushed to have the clothing and wedding presents of his murdered wife to be sold at public auction. He attended the sale himself without showing the slightest amount of unease, and after the auction had been completed, he continued to haggle with other dealers who were present for the few articles which had not been purchased. Then, under a further alias of Mr. Duncan, Frederick took up his residence at the Cathedral Hotel in Swanston Street, Melbourne, in one of the busiest parts of the city. While there, he addressed the following note to Holt's matrimonial agency, as he was looking for another wife. The letter goes as follows. Cathedral Hotel, Melbourne. 2nd January 1892. Matrimonial. The undersigned at the above address wishes to meet a young lady with the above intentions. She must be good looking, aged 18 or 20, and know something of housekeeping. I myself am 32 years, engineer by trade. I have £360 in the bank, and am about to enter into a good appointment. Am sober, steady man, am just from England, and have 14 years testimonial from one master. Please enclose photo of lady. Yours, F. Duncan. A letter acknowledging receipt of this, and advising Mr. Duncan that there were several good-looking ladies that met his requirements hoping for marriage on the books at the office. Frederick responded that he would be in contact within a few days to start the proceedings. However, this was an appointment he did not keep. During this time, Frederick acquainted himself with a gentleman who worked at a jeweller, and he went to great lengths to do so. Once they were familiar to some small degree, Frederick gave the firm a few minor jobs. The one that stands out the most is he had requested the wedding ring of Emily be mounted on a black ebony stick that he constantly carried. Like, how sick is that? The detectives were told that Mr. Williams had left for Sydney, and following their usual practice of visiting leading hotels and coffee palaces in search for new arrivals, they soon learned that the man they were looking for had stayed at the Wentworth Hotel, Church Hill, but has since travelled to Bathurst with a lady he was allegedly engaged to. I can only imagine how excited the detectives would have been getting at this point, if not also really concerned for this alleged fiancé. So close they could already hear the click of the cuffs on his wrists. So they followed him to Bathurst, where the local police were immediately communicated with, but again they had just missed him. This time, Frederick was headed to Western Australia. A telegraph was sent to Western Australia, and the boast of the Melbourne detectives was fulfilled. It took just 9 days from the discovery of Emily's body for Frederick to be captured. Following publicity surrounding the discovery of Emily's body at Windsor, investigations at Rainhill revealed the decomposing bodies of Marie Deeming and their 4 children: Bertha, who was 10, Mary, who was 7, Sydney, who was 5, and Leela, who was only 18 months old, buried beneath the reconcreted floors of the Dinham Villa. And it was discovered that the murders had taken place while Frederick was using the alias Albert Williams and was courting Emily on or about the 26th of July, 1891. At an inquest held at Rainhill on the 18th of March, 1892, Frederick's brother identified Marie and gave some accounts of his activities. The Rainhill murders had gone undetected for 8 months. It appears their family had been led to believe that Marie and the children were in Brighton on a holiday, and then assumed they were overseas again, as this was a relatively normal pattern for them. Frederick had even made several visits to Birkenhead to reassure Martha that her sister and the children were well. What further impeded the murders from being found any sooner was that the lease under the alias of Albert Williams. This lease also stipulated that the house should not be sold or relet for 6 months because of the imminent arrival of Colonel Brooks and or Mr. Williams' sister. As mentioned earlier, this lease also allowed him to resurface the floors. It was on the 25th of April, 1892, that Frederick was tried at Melbourne Supreme Court. Alfred Deakin, who was later Prime Minister of Australia, tried to mount a plea of insanity. The defence also questioned the impact of newspaper reporting on Frederick on the jury. Perhaps wishing to aid the defence of insanity, Frederick also claimed to have caught syphilis in London and to have received visitation from his mother's spirit, which urged his actions. The only issue that was faced by this approach was that Frederick was no longer able to claim complete innocence as he had originally planned to do so. But in classic style, before the jury would go to deliberate, he went on a lengthy, rambling speech of self-justification, which gave way to a fit of rage in which he railed against the spectators and accused women of being the spreaders of disease. But a happy ending is a happy ending, and Frederick Deeming was found guilty. The pompous twat spent his last days writing his autobiography and poetry. He also spent time talking to the Church of England ministers, to whom he supposedly confessed. The sentence of the court was confirmed by the Executive Council on the 9th of May, 1892, and the Judicial Committee of Privy Council refused his appeal on the 19th of May in 1892. At 10:01 a.m. on the 23rd of May, Frederick Bailey Deeming was hanged, and the autobiography that he wrote in jail was destroyed. So that gives him a current kill count of 9, but it goes up a further 6 victims if you believe that he could be Jack the Ripper. It really does make you wonder what was in that autobiography before it was destroyed, but the intention at the time would have been to give him no more attention. And honestly, I can't blame them for that. But to understand the theory, we are going to have to do a brief dive into Jack the Ripper and compare timelines. Now, I do give a word of warning here. While I have looked into everything, there is no solid outcome, and I am no ripperologist. But in case you have managed to stumble into my podcast without any knowledge of Jack the Ripper or the Whitechapel murders, I will start there. The late 1800s were not exactly a safe or happy time for London, as it had experienced a massive influx of Irish immigrants, followed by Jewish refugees fleeing from mostly Eastern Europe. The parish of Whitechapel in East End became overcrowded, with the population reaching roughly 80,000 inhabitants by 1888. So you would have had many people in one area struggling to gain resources and still frightened. Understandably, the people in this area would start acting out and doing what was needed to survive. Robbery, violence, and alcohol dependency became commonplace, and the rampant poverty drove many women to prostitution. In October of 1888, it was estimated that there were 62 brothels and 1,200 women working as sex workers in Whitechapel, with an estimated 8,500 people residing in the 233 common lodging houses every night. The nightly price for a single bed being a 4p, and the cost of sleeping upon the lean-to, which is where you would sleep on a sitting bench with a rope stretched across those sleeping, being 2p for one person. So long story short, it was hard times. These people were facing starvation, disease, homelessness, and Jack the Ripper took advantage of this. During this time, there was 11 separate murders spanning from 3rd of April 1888 to the 13th of February 1891, and it has been argued for hundreds of years at this point whether they were all related to the same person. However, 5 of the 11 Whitechapel murders are known as the Canonical Five and are widely believed to be the work of the Ripper. The first 2 cases in this file are those of Emma Elizabeth Smith and Martha Tabram. These were not included in the Canonical Five. Emma was robbed and sexually assaulted in Osborne Street, Whitechapel, at approximately 1:30 a.m. on the 3rd of April 1888. The attack was linked to the later murders, although most authors believe that Emma's murder was linked to general East End gang violence and was unrelated to the Ripper. Martha's murder, while regarded by some as not connected to the Ripper case, does sound like it really could have been. She was murdered on a staircase landing in George Street on the 7th of August 1888. She had been violently stabbed 39 times, with the wounds being to her throat, lungs, heart, liver, spleen, stomach, and abdomen, with additional knife wounds inflicted to her breasts and vagina. The reason there are those who do not believe it is connected is because despite the closeness of location and date to the later canonical Ripper murders, the attack was different. The next murders were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, also informally known as the Canonical Five. Mary Ann Nichols was discovered on Friday the 31st of August 1888 in Bucks Row. Her throat had 2 deep cuts, one of which completely severed all the tissue down to the vertebrae. Her vagina had been stabbed twice, and the lower part of her abdomen was partly ripped open, causing her bowels to protrude. Several other incisions inflicted to both sides of her abdomen had also been caused by the same knife. Does that not sound vastly more calm and controlled rather than what happened to Martha? Like the Ripper realized that his attack was too messy, or he didn't really get a chance to enjoy what he did. So he took more time with Mary Ann Nichols. The next of the canonical five was Annie Chapman. A week later, she was found on the 8th of September, 1888, near the steps of a doorway at the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Her throat had 2 deep cuts, her abdomen had been cut entirely open, with a section of flesh from her stomach being placed upon her left shoulder, and another section of flesh along her small intestines were removed and placed above her right shoulder. If that wasn't gruesome enough for you, her autopsy also revealed that her uterus and sections of her bladder and vagina had been removed. This sounds like classic escalation to me. Martha was frenzied and angry. Mary Ann, he took his time. But Annie, he likely felt the need to be really theatrical, especially as the bodies were being found so quickly. So now not only was he taking out his rage on these women, but he was enjoying the attention it was bringing. So he would have felt bold to move on to something bigger again, thus triggering what is known as the double event. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were both killed early in the morning hours of Sunday, September the 30th, 1888. Elizabeth's body was discovered at approximately 1 a.m. in Dutfield's yard off Burner Street. Her throat had been cut so deep, not only had it cut through her carotid artery, but also her trachea. However, she had no further mutilation, which left many wondering if she was a Ripper victim or if he had just been interrupted. Catherine's body was found in a corner of Meter Square in the city of London just 45 minutes after Elizabeth's body was found. Her throat was slashed from ear to ear, her abdomen was ripped open, leaving a long, deep and jagged wound. Her intestines had been placed over her right shoulder, with a section of intestine being completely detached and placed between her body and left arm. The left kidney and a major part of Catherine's uterus had been removed, and her face had been disfigured, with her nose cut off, her cheeks slashed, and cuts through her eyelids. This was so violent that later a section of her ear was removed from her clothing. The police surgeon who conducted the autopsy stated his opinion these mutilations would have at least taken 5 minutes to complete. Then it was quiet from the Ripper until the 9th of November, 1888, when the body of Mary Kelly was found. Unlike the murders before her, she had been slaughtered in the privacy of her own room. To me, this signals that the Ripper really did not want to be interrupted this time, and wanted the chance to not only take his time, but to get away cleanly, and this would be the crescendo of his violence. Mary's face had been hacked beyond all recognition, her throat slashed so deeply it went down to the spine, and her abdomen was missing most of its organs. Her uterus, kidneys, and one breast had been placed beneath her head, and other viscera from her body placed beside her foot, about the bed, and sections of her abdomen and thighs upon the bedside table. Horrifyingly, her heart was missing from the crime scene. Multiple ashes found within the fireplace suggests that the murderer had burned several items to illuminate the single room as he continued his fiendish acts, and a recent fire had been hot enough to melt the solder between the kettle and its spout, which had fallen into the grate of the fireplace. Now I have you filled on what the Ripper did, let's see if it can be linked to Frederick Deeming. Could he have been in the area at the time of these murders? Yes, it is actually quite possible, even with the massacre he allegedly carried out in South Africa. If we look at the timeline and tell it like a story, it would sound something like this. It is currently August of 1888, and Frederick has been suffering. His wife isn't really of any use to him, and he has also spent 2 years being impotent after catching syphilis from a sex worker. Even though he knows he's not the only man to catch this illness, he is angry and wants revenge. One late night, he sees Martha, and maybe she looks a little like the woman who infected him, and he feels his blood boil. She had made him suffer for so long, revenge seems perfectly fair to Frederick. He follows Martha, slipping between any small crowds where he could blend in, until he found her alone on the staircase of George Yard. The air is cold and he wants to go somewhere warm, so he doesn't hesitate, and in a rage-fueled frenzy, he starts viciously stabbing Martha, her screams not really getting a chance to leave her throat. As he would later claim that he heard the voice of his mother telling him to do awful things, he continued to stab her breasts and vagina before disappearing into the night. Frederick had no idea how good it felt to kill. He already enjoyed the power he felt as he swindled people of their money, possessions, and services. But taking a life just felt stronger. He took his time to consider his actions as he continued on with his con artistry. He did in fact feel strong. But just 24 days later, he would have been hit with bloodlust once again while roaming the East End streets of Whitechapel. This time, he would have stumbled upon Mary Ann Nichols. As Frederick was charismatic and not hideous, he wouldn't have scared her or any of these women from going near him, especially if he was offering money for their services. And going by the way he does things, he would have offered a much higher amount than anyone else would have. Enjoying what he had done last time, but feeling it went too quickly, he decided to slow down what he was doing and enjoy himself, likely hearing the voice of his mother like some 19th century Norman Bates creep. While he took more time with Mary Ann, he felt he could do better, and 8 days later, he would just do that with Annie Chapman. Ever the theatrical boy, this time he posed her organs around her body so she would be horrifying to find. But what about the gap between Annie and the double event? Simply put, Frederick was busy with actual work. Catching a steamship to South Africa would only take roughly 7 days, 10 max. While in South Africa, he flared. But this bloodlust wasn't directed at a woman doing her best to survive. No, it was directed at 3 men who were trying to put a stop to his diamond mine swindle in Transvaal. Realizing his mistake and likely feeling unhinged, he would have then caught the next steamship back to London, bringing him back in time for the double event. On the night of the double event, he would have been disrupted while trying to butcher Elizabeth Stride and fled the scene. Likely mad that he didn't get the opportunity he wanted with her when he stumbled upon Catherine Eddowes. At this time, Frederick is unhinged and pent up from not being able to finish what he started. So when he got Catherine alone, he took his time, unleashing all of his fury on her, mutilating her beyond all recognition. He then would have been amused by people trying to take credit for his work with letters that were sent in, and decided, due to Whitechapel being overrun, it was easy for him to get away with leaving the bodies in the open. His last Ripper victim was many months later, after what would have been a busy time for him due to his movements between Hull, Birkenhead and Whitechapel. Perhaps he had grown bored and that bloodlust just got him all over again. But with his wife Marie looking over his shoulder, he felt it was best to play things just a little safe, and followed Mary Keller into her room, where he then took his time really destroying her. This would have placated him, as he then spent most of his time working on his cons and taking money where he could, until 1891, when he murdered his first wife and children. But I've already covered those murders in last week's episode. So let's look at the arguments for and against. Because while I feel like I could grab my tinfoil hat and claim it was Frederick, I like following the evidence to the conclusion, not making the evidence fit the conclusion I have. In arguments for, we have the fact that he could have realistically caught a steamer to South Africa, committed the swindle and murders, and returned in time for the double event. Unfortunately, while I dug as deep as I could with what time I had, because I literally did this within less time than what I usually do these days, I could not find any listings of the ships doing those routes from before 1890, which is a shame because it's just 2 years off. If you can, please do let me know if you come across any of it, because I'm just itching to find out what happened. During 1888, not a lot of what Frederick was doing was able to be coherently traced. Due to the sheer numbers of aliases that he had at this time, it is impossible to confirm what he had or had not done. That being said, there was a rumor that he had been spending time in prison for a smaller crime he had committed under one of those aliases. But if that is so, it would have to be one that has not been recorded as linked to Frederick, because his names that I am aware of did not show up in those listings. So this lands more in a Schrodinger's cat kind of place. Both proves and disproves that he could have been in prison and or the Ripper. However, against him being the Ripper, due to there being no way to trace Frederick, it has also been said that he may have been living in South Africa during 1888 with his family and was not even in London. Another in favour of this possible Ripper is that not only did he contract syphilis, but it is also noted in his history that he fell prey to a severe attack of brain fever while on a voyage and likely never recovered, making it just that much easier for him to commit such vile acts. Newspapers published stories that Frederick had been seen in Whitechapel in 1888 and that he was seen to have purchased knives in the area. One article posted in 1892 tells of a Thomas Ryan taking in a man who wanted food and drink and described the man about 5'6" in height and wore an Oxford cap on his head with a light check ulster with a tipped button to his throat. The interaction that Thomas had with this person only became stranger as it went on. While discussing the Whitechapel murders, this mystery man looked Thomas directly in the face and said, "Do you know who committed the murders?" And then calmly went on to say, "I did them. I've had a lot of trouble lately. I came back from India and got in trouble at once. I lost my watch and chain and £10. Thomas understandably believed the man was just intoxicated and talking a load of rubbish. But after a time, Frederick invited Thomas to join him at a temperance meeting. Thomas declined, and Frederick said that he would be back later to spend the night, but never returned. It was later proven that this was Frederick, as he had been there under the alias of Mr. Duncan. Historian Mike Covell came out in 2016 after diving deep into many hidden files regarding Jack the Ripper, where Frederick's name appeared in several Scotland Yard reports on the Whitechapel murders, and a London dressmaker was reported as claiming that Frederick had been courting her in 1888 and claimed during a trial that he was in fact the Ripper. In this article, Mike is quoted as saying, "Previously, Deeming was thought to be in prison at the time of the Whitechapel murders, but I have found out this was not the case." A newspaper stand vendor described how Deeming always bought loads of newspapers after the murders and seemed very excited to read about them. Which, let's be honest, that is classic serial killer behavior. Another in favour is that while he was in prison, Frederick allegedly told his fellow inmates that he was indeed Jack the Ripper, but never confessed to authorities. However, that argument is also against him. How many murderers start confessing to other crimes when they are aware that they are going to be executed, purely for clout? Even with all that is listed, it was a highly popular opinion, post his execution, that Frederick had indeed been Jack the Ripper. And in 1912, Crate Mayer's Melbourne Waxwork had an installment of Frederick burying Martha, and many of those who had seen the work claimed that he was identical to Jack the Ripper. But if we consider looks alone, we would have to look for any eyewitnesses of Jack the Ripper, and there were not many. However, descriptions were given for a man seen with Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. But even then, the witness for Mary Kelly's suspect was classified as unreliable and dismissed. Again, caution is needed to be taken when considering Annie Chapman's eyewitness, as she stated she never saw the suspect's face, only the back of his head, but somehow gave an estimated age of the suspect being in his 40s. But she did agree with other witnesses regarding his dress and ethnicity. But if we take into account all agreed upon features, this is what we have for Jack the Ripper. He was in his late 20s, early 30s, approximately 5'7" tall, Jewish appearance, shabby clothing with a neckerchief, jacket, and soft peaked hat, big sandy coloured moustache, broad shoulders, and dark hair. Frederick's appearance can be explained as follows: late 20s to early 30s, of average height at about 5'8", a ginger or sandy moustache with a brow that jutted out, thin lips, and a large nose. He was also considered rugged, as he had broad shoulders and a solid frame. Reports on his hair colour changes between being dark to fair-haired. However, all pictures of him are in black and white, and it looks like it could have been that type of brown hair that almost changes colour in different light. So during the day, it could have almost been sandy, but in the dark of night, under a hat, it could have been more like a chestnut. That all being said, as it goes for eyewitness descriptions, I might be a little ignorant, but I don't quite know what they mean by Jewish appearance. However, the idea of attempting to blame Jewish people for this horrific act would not have gone unnoticed. As stated earlier, there had been an influx of Jewish immigrants trying to find peace and safety in Whitechapel. And let's be honest, whether it's hundreds of years ago or just this year, humans aren't well known for welcoming immigrants into their country with open arms and a smile. While the description of the Ripper is similar to the description of Frederick Deeming, I do believe it is also similar to thousands of other white men. And to go against this as well, we also have the fact that Whitechapel would have had its fair share of people with a violent streak in them lurking in the shadows. But let's look at just one more aspect of this. If Frederick was the killer, why did he change his MO? With the murders as Jack the Ripper, there were too many people in those areas. He could have done so in front of others without really worrying, as at the end of the day he could slink into hiding with other unsuspecting people and vanish without a trace. But then it changed for South Africa. I don't believe he was there for murder. These people died because they were in his way. His first wife and children? He couldn't butcher them for all to see and get away with it, as the Rainhill Villa was pretty isolated, so if his wife and children were found that way, he would have been the prime suspect, which would have put a stop to his plans. But he still couldn't help himself with the theatrics. Even though he covered the bodies with cement, he still had to pose them. There are many who believe that the way he posed them was reminiscent of how he posed Annie Chapman and Catherine Eddowes. However, instead of intestines sprawled over her body, it was their children. And finally, Emily. Being in Australia on a street with close neighbours who were already showing signs of being nosy, he knew to kill Emily off, he would have to do so without drawing attention. This would have been the reason he sent her out for the day to prepare the back room away from prying eyes. A quick death followed by being buried in a way that he hoped would hide her forever, allowing him to get away with it and go on to marry and kill again and again. Am I giving Frederick Deeming too much credit? Possibly. But this was a man who made a living off lying, reading the room, and getting away with it. Even if he isn't Jack the Ripper, the process of hiding the bodies of his wives and children would still be relevant. But at the end of the day, Jack the Ripper stalked the streets of Whitechapel 135 years ago. So the best we can do these days is speculate. Do I believe that Frederick Deeming is Jack the Ripper? I honestly do not know. There is decent evidence to suggest that he could be a logical choice as a suspect. But we do not have DNA evidence to trace or track because there is no way it would have lasted that long. What I do believe, in my heart of hearts, without fail, is that Frederick Deeming was a monster. This is a man who murdered his first wife and children solely because he considered them to be in the way of what he wanted to achieve. He married Emily only to kill her. He also had plans to do the same with Helen if she hadn't realized that he was already married. And horrifyingly, the woman he was suddenly engaged to when he was caught in Western Australia, he was also planning on marrying and killing her too. So I believe he is a terrifyingly violent and dangerous man who would fit the bill to be Jack the Ripper. But I also believe he is a liar, and it is proven that he is a liar. So who knows what he has said that can be believed. But at the end of the day, he is possibly one of the most violent people I have covered on this podcast. And to be honest, I am glad I'm done because he does not have to live in my head anymore. We have 6 murders confirmed to be actioned by Frederick, 3 in South Africa, Martha Tabram, and the canonical 5. This puts his potential body count up to 15, which again, it's frustrating because it cannot be completely proven. But that is where I'm going to leave it for today. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. You can comment on the episode on YouTube, the relevant pictures on Facebook or Instagram at What You Should Know Australia, or you can send it to me in an email to whiskerpod@gmail.com. wyskapod@gmail.com. That is wyskapod@gmail.com. If you haven't already, go harass the 5-star review button, drop a like, say hello. But until next week, stay safe and stay hydrated. Bye!